and welcome to our municipality. We're a student-run podcast exploring local government, politics, and advocacy. I'm Natalia, and I'm here with Adrian to interview Kimberly J. Morgan. She's a professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Professor Morgan's research focuses on politics of social policy in the United States and Western Europe, with particular interest in family policies, healthcare, the welfare state, and immigration. She also happens to be my current professor, but beyond that, there's a lot of the conversation about Joe Biden's immigration enforcement recently, and the federal government has very little control over how immigration policy is implemented on the ground, and that comes down to local government. And so we're here to discuss kind of that intersection. And so, Adrian, if you want to start with the first question.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for the intro, Natalia, and Professor Morgan, I'm really excited to have you here today. My first question for you is, what brought you to study immigration and welfare?
Well, my original research agenda was very much around the politics of the welfare state. That's what I was most interested in graduate school, and I wrote my dissertation on childcare policy, which made me think about questions of the labor supply in general. I was just interested in workers and policies to help workers. And when thinking about women as workers, I started thinking about other types of workers, like immigrant workers. And some people have said that, there can be almost a kind of substitution in some cases between, certain workforces, and that, growing immigration in some countries can influence labor market policy in a variety of ways. And so that kind of got me thinking about immigration. And, and then I found other kinds of interesting connections between immigration and the study of the welfare state, which I'm happy to talk more about in this podcast.
Okay, thank you so much. And it is really interesting to see those intersections, because I think that's kind of some of the beauty of political science, is that you start to see how everything's interconnected. And so it's cool to, hear about that. But more moving on, can you tell us more about the focus of your research and what you're currently doing work on?
So I study welfare systems and immigration policy in European countries as well as in the United States. I tend to kind of move back and forth in my research, in part because I find the comparisons interesting, also because I like spending time in different countries. But among the things that I've been really focused on in recent years, I started thinking about how it is that European countries have much smaller populations of unauthorized migrants. And I wondered how it was that they really reduced the number of unauthorized migrants. And in part, it's because they have had amnesty policies, they've had campaigns to legalize unauthorized migrants, but they also, in comparison to the United States, they seem to have mechanisms of immigration enforcement that I wanted to try to understand. That's especially kind of surprising because, in the European Union, you don't have formal borders between states anymore. And so it seems like the role of the state in immigration enforcement should be less. And I wanted to understand why that's not seemingly the case. And what I discovered was that they actually use their welfare systems to some degree to really act as agents of immigration enforcement. They exclude people from access to, everything except education and basic health care. And they use their kind of welfare bureaucracies, in a sense, as ways to make sure that it's hard for people to live in European societies. Because if you can't have access to basic benefits, if you're having difficulty finding employment, and if you're likely to be uncovered for working unauthorized at a work site, then it's harder to live, and people are simply not going to be able to stay in a place. Whereas my observation about the United States was that there's a lot more space for unauthorized migrants to work and to live and to find a way to exist. It may not be at a very high level of standard of living, but it's possible, I think, in a way that is actually not possible in a lot of European countries. So my research has been trying to understand a little bit about that space that exists in the US context and how it got shrunk in the European context.
That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. My next question is if you could talk a little bit about how that space exists in the US for, you're talking about unauthorized immigrants, and maybe just explain briefly about safe cities or sanctuary cities, or other ways that you think that there's that kind of space in the US.
So I think a really important point about the United States is to note that we have fairly lax enforcement of labor laws as a whole. We don't impose very often sanctions on employers for hiring unauthorized migrants. A lot of people have argued that it's kind of the crucial tool of immigration enforcement is to close off access to labor markets. European countries have actually invested a ton in that. They have stronger labor market enforcement apparatuses anyway. They already had invested a lot more in making sure that labor standards were met and so on. But then they've also kind of used those mechanisms to make it hard for unauthorized migrants to find work. Whereas in the United States, we adopted kind of some what's called employer sanctions laws, on employers to try to require that they only hire authorized migrants and authorized workers. And then we basically never have enforced them. And so there's a lot of room in the labor market. There's a lot of kind of space for people, if they can find work, which they often can, to be able to support themselves in the United States. So I think that's one important source of room. And then I think another important source of room in the US, which one can find some parallels in the European context, are the kind of supportive local policies, which really gets to the point of your podcast. Policies that try to facilitate integration into local communities. I think in a lot of parts of the US, at either the state level, but especially at the local government level, policymakers can be kind of pragmatic about the fact that if you have a large population of migrants, including a lot of unauthorized migrants, having restrictive policies against them is kind of counterproductive from community relations standpoints, from policing standpoints, from having good relations with the communities that you're overseeing. If you have a group of people that's terrified to be there, that feels like they're going to be swept up in an ICE raid any minute, that's not really conducive to kind of good relationships between local government officials and the people living in their communities. And so local governments have actually often been fairly pragmatic about how to address the needs of unauthorized populations, and have try to come up with mechanisms to incorporate them, whether it's providing some kind of identification system so people can have an ID, that enables them to get access to certain kinds of things, making sure people can have driver's licenses, so that rather than having people driving without driver's licenses, and therefore not being kind of screened for driving, you make sure that people come and they get a driver's license, they take a driver's test. And I mean, it's just it's a practical thing, and very important, obviously, for people to have, the ability to drive in this country. And important from the standpoint of local government officials to make sure that, people can drive well. So you see what I mean about the pragmatism. There can be lots of policies like that. And in fact, many local governments have adopted policies like this, really to try to sort of recognize the realities on the ground and help incorporate people into local communities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, if people, because of lax policy, are going to be in your backyard anyways, you might as well try to make relations a little bit better and a little easier and try to find that balance. So that makes a lot of sense. But then how do these policies differ when you look at different regions? Is there a difference in local opinion depending on where you are?
I think, one could have said that in past, but it's changed as more migrants have moved to different parts of the country. And so you have migrant communities that have developed all over the United States now. And so whereas in past people might have thought, oh, well, this is an issue for Texas or Arizona or California, I think now that's very much changed. It's changed in two ways. It's meant that the issue of immigration has become a source of antipathy and opposition in communities that previously didn't care much about it. So, some parts of the South, for instance, I think of Alabama as kind of a really good example where, the meat processing industry and slaughterhouses have drawn a lot of migrant workers in recent years. And that has led to then a lot of conflict about having these migrant communities forming, and then it's created some support for more tough enforcement. But on the other hand, you have then pushback against that, or you have other parts of the country where there's much more supportive policies that basically say, this is the reality. These are people in our community. These are our neighbors. These are our friends. We don't want to have tough policies. We want to have policies that sort of recognize the reality. And there is really a kind of business side to this, which I think is often interesting. I mean, in addition to employers often benefiting from migrant workers, including unauthorized migrant workers, local communities become transformed around migration. you have lots of local businesses who will come to recognize that, wow, all these migrants, unauthorized or not, are a source of economic growth in our community. They're buying these products. They need these things. They're purchasing, insurance policies. So, local health, life insurance or, companies will be like, wait a minute, this is actually kind of a good thing. And so you'll get sort of defenders of more supportive policies that, again, kind of recognize the realities on the ground.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I guess, like, given the changes in like policy, I guess, that have come from immigrant communities appearing all across the U.S. So thanks for sharing that. For my next question, I want to ask what the interaction has been like, or that you observed has been like between social services and immigration policy. Specifically, I'm interested in like the county level, because it seems like that's where usually social services are handled. But if you're familiar with that at the city level as well, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, I think in a lot of communities, again, there's a desire to make sure that immigrant communities have full access to local services. Now, federal law bars access to certain kinds of most welfare benefits. So if we're talking about sort of federally subsidized benefits and services, there's a lot of exclusion, not only for unauthorized migrants, but even for legal migrants of a lot of programs. But when it comes to sort of state and local policy, that can be another matter. I mean, as long as it's not something that's federally financed with strings attached to it, local governments can do what they want. And so a good example would actually be during the pandemic, the way a lot of local communities have done outreach and tried to make sure that people have access to food, to kind of basic income support, to other types of assistance, really trying to reach people who probably have really borne the brunt of, shutdowns, of, closure of work sites and closure of normal channels of sustenance. And so that's been, I think, a good example of the way in which local communities have often really kind of stepped up and tried to make sure that that outreach is there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. And thinking about my next question about like the roles that immigrants play in like activist organizations and influencing local politics. I know in class we talked about, the movement around DACA and how influential immigrants were in that, and how, it kind of disappeared as quickly as it came. But I'm curious how immigrants have affected activism for immigration policy in other areas, especially in the pandemic, as you said, since a lot of those communities are the hardest hit. So I'm just curious how organizing works in local government for immigrant communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think, excuse me, that these kinds of organizations have been incredibly important for, for public policy and also for this kind of more grassroots level outreach. I mean, it's a real characteristic of the United States that we organize. I mean, people organize. They set up groups. They set up civil society groups. They get engaged in a way at the grassroots all the way up to the national level. That's like I always think it was a really distinctive feature about the United States, and it's very much held true in the area of immigration. So, around policy, for instance, I would say that a lot of kind of pro-migrant groups have, played really a major role, for instance, in challenging something like the employer sanctions policy that I was talking about earlier. There's a lot of criticism on the left-hand side of the political spectrum of really restrictive policies towards unauthorized migrant work, for instance. And I think one reason why we don't have more enforcement of those policies, well, there's a strong business opposition to enforcement, so that's there. But then there's a kind of funny coalition also with people on the left who say, if we were to really strictly enforce these kinds of policies, look, we have a really large unauthorized migrant population in this country of 10 to 12 million people here. What would happen to them if they really were shut out of the labor market? It could be devastating, and they'd get pushed further into really insalubrious forms of work and even more exploitative forms of work, and that this is not a positive outcome either. And so, advocacy groups have on the migrant side have I think been really influential in something like that policy. They've also been really influential in pushing back against enforcement of immigration law from ICE, through raids and requiring local governments to turn over migrants who they come upon in the course of doing law enforcement. I think those groups have been really essential in pushing back and in publicizing the sort of consequences of these raids and using social media to draw attention to the effects on communities, on families. And that's had a really big difference in these policies.
Interesting. That's really good to hear, at least for me. So next, for our last question, I'm interested in what you think the future of immigration policy might look like under the Biden administration, and then how local governments might continue to depart from federal policy in either new or old ways.
So yeah, the Biden administration has lots of ambitious goals for immigration reform, but it's going to run up against the problem that it doesn't have a big enough majority in the House or Senate to really achieve the kind of reform that they are talking about. And it's been the problem for comprehensive immigration reform for many decades. I mean, we haven't really had comprehensive reform since the mid 80s, and there were some bills in the 1990s that were pretty big as well. But since then, we've pretty much been stuck. And neither side has had a big enough majority to ever push through one vision of reform or the other. So I have low expectations about comprehensive reform. And by comprehensive reform, I would mean, some kind of pathway to legal status, some kind of new labor migration program that takes into consideration the demand for these workers on the U.S. side and the demand for jobs on the migrant side. People coming from Central America in particular. There'd be questions about asylum reform, and those would be the kind of basic pieces. And then inevitably, there would have to be some kind of increase in enforcement to get enough people around the reform. So this would be what comprehensive reform would look like. Some version of this gets proposed every other year, never goes anywhere, and I don't expect it to necessarily go anywhere under the Biden administration. What will change then is much what has changed under Trump and changed under Obama and was the case under Bush before Obama, is the use of the executive powers of the presidency, right? So using regulations, using sort of how you orient the sort of behavior of the enforcement bureaucracy. That is where we're going to see shifts, and we're already seeing shifts where the Biden administration is trying to undo a lot of what Trump did. And that has real implications for state and local government. The Trump administration really wanted to push, push back against sanctuary cities, push back against the resistance of some local and state governments to collaborating with immigration and customs enforcement. And really tried to get more local communities to hand over migrants that they encounter, unauthorized migrants, so that they could be subject to detention and deportation. The Biden administration is going to undo all of that and instead be much more, warm and friendly towards sanctuary cities. It will, if they, continue to have a focus on enforcement in the interior, they'll probably do like Obama and focus that on people who have been, convicted of crime, serious crimes. And so I think there'll be a lot more leeway for state and local governments, with regard to these policies. I would say that's the most likely outcome, at least with regard to, these types of issues.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially since in class we talked so much about how there's gridlock and there has not been a lot of change. And it seems like local government, the federalist system in some ways, is allowing local governments essentially to pick up the slack of what is not being done at the federal level. And I actually had one more last quick question before we close everything out. As someone who's incredibly knowledgeable in this field and has kind of looked at this issue from numerous different levels, obviously, and is in the heart of DC with all these other people thinking about immigration, what is something that you feel is often overlooked in immigration policy that people don't seem to give it enough attention or ignore, that you think is actually really relevant and can really, enrich our perspective?
Well, I suppose in the U.S., the debate has been so much focused on unauthorized migration, kind of viewed through the lens of law breaking and the border. People really, this whole fixation on the border and border enforcement, and this kind of image people often have of unauthorized migrants as people, trying to get across the border when they're not allowed. And, it kind of misses the bigger picture, which is that the reason why we have migration into the United States and why European countries face lots of migration is because our economy is pulling people in. I mean, we have big sectors of our economy where there's demand for labor that's not being met in the current by current workers in the United States. And that's a whole array of jobs, from what we would call sort of lower skill jobs to really high skill jobs. There's the U.S. economy has benefited in huge ways from migration, from the fact that we have drawn people from around the world to contribute to our well-being. And I think a kind of recognition of that, and thinking about sort of, well, how could we think about migration policy and labor migration policy in a way that generates some more win-wins, right? That continues to sort of enable us to benefit, but also opens up pathways for people to come and also benefit from this. So rather than having this kind of fixation on enforcement and borders, why don't we sort of ask, well, why is it we have migration to this country, and what is it that migration brings, and how can migration be thought of as a kind of positive for people who are the migrants themselves and the sending countries, as well as the receiving countries like our own. I wish we could have that kind of reasoned discussion and honest discussion, as opposed to sort of this, focus on enforcement and this fixation on kind of walling ourselves off from the world, which has been, the case in the last years.
That's super interesting. Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our episode. So thank you so much, Professor Morgan, for joining us today and sharing the work that you do. I'm really thankful for the insight you provided about some of the pragmatic reactions that local officials have had to unauthorized immigration, and the bit of perspective on the bigger picture of our economy and nation as a whole. So also thanks to everyone listening to the episode. Please feel free to reach out to us on social media and stay tuned for our next episodes coming up. We're really glad you could join us today, and we hope to see you again soon in our municipality.